What have I done? This is Pandora, my 1,000-gallon cloud rainforest vivarium. Attached to Arcadia, a giant tree vivarium on the floor above, and to Hydromeda, a giant wetlands vivarium. Within these three massive tanks, I'm studying how a robust, tropical ecosystem of plants, fungi, and animals react to certain ecological events acting on the system. And this week, all the creatures of the rainforest were about to undergo an experience of typhonic proportions. For the first time, our rainforest would experience a typhoon simulation, a weather event it would have to contend with in the wild. I was a bit worried about this experiment though. Would our rainforest and its creatures survive a simulation of a typhoon? The answer left me stunned and with one of the craziest lessons I'll never forget. Please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon. Welcome to the AC fam. Enjoy. When the Wheel of Gaia, the randomizer I created for determining ecological events in our rainforest, landed on Typhoon last week, I felt a lump in my throat when it occurred to me that I would be organizing a potentially catastrophic event in our forest. All the various creatures living on and in the soils would be directly impacted by this typhoon. But I was willing to try this because I felt nature had to have a reason for typhoons, and that they even somehow benefited rainforests in some way. Perhaps a super watering of the plants? I was determined to find out. I took one last look into the vivarium and took a deep breath. I'm so sorry about this, Pandora, but this is for science. I left to trigger the rains and prayed the outcome would not be devastating. Arcadia was first. Beyonce, one of the resident chubby frogs, who had somehow managed to climb all the way up here to the canopy from Pandora, emerged to greet the rains. Typhoons are always the signal for the chubby frogs to emerge and often breed. There was one spot where the spray was more of a stream, and that was to keep the food bowl of the micro squirrels, where I add dietary elements they can't get from the rainforest, dry. And as I was about to find out after the typhoon, I was so glad I did it this way. Next was Hydromeda. The rains didn't quite affect the aquatic residents of the wetlands much. They just danced through the waters as the rain fell from above. And then it was Pandora's turn. This was where the rains would leave the greatest impact. As the water began to fall, I prayed that our rainforest would survive what it was up against for the next 24 hours. Turns out, the craziness had just begun with some insane surprises on the way. So in case you're new to the term typhoon, it's basically a hurricane, but located in the Indian or Western Pacific Oceans. I currently live in the Philippines, where we get about 20 tropical cyclones per year, at least 10 of which are typhoons. Now, growing up in Toronto, Canada, I've experienced storms before, but when I moved out here 14 years ago, I had no idea what I was up against. I quickly learned the tropics are indeed a whole different beast. This is a typhoon that hit the country last week. Now I find there are two kinds of typhoons. One where it's mostly wind, and one where it rains like crazy. Both types can be serious. This one is the rain type. These typhoons can last for a few hours, to several days, to even up to 2 weeks. We have underground drainage pipes in the soil to help funnel out the copious amounts of water in my yard. But even still, my property becomes a mini wetlands every time. The water flows as creatures emerge from the soils and scramble to find dry land, lest be swept away by the currents. Millipedes, isopods, ants, crickets, and more cling to any surface above the ground to wait out the storm. Meanwhile, gravity causes the water to form streams, which find the quickest route downward. And in this case, it's my stairs, which turns into a mini waterfall every time it storms. The brown water ends up in a drainage sewer system, which is collected into a sort of canal area that we built along the side of my property, and ends up flowing into a seasonal creek in the forest, where the water is carried off to a wetland somewhere far away. This particular typhoon lasted about 3 hours, and even after the rains had ceased, there was still a ton of water pooling everywhere. The typhoon I wanted to simulate in our rainforest was this type. A movement caught my eye amidst the storm. To my surprise, it was the quails. I totally thought they would be hunkering down under the stump to stay dry, but surprisingly no. They chose to step out into the rain and began to forage for food. In the middle of a storm? My guess was that they were eating the emerging insects that were being flushed out of the soils. I then noticed the birds exhibiting the bathing response, something birds do when it rains, where they fluff their feathers and shake their head to get all the debris and oils to run off them. Rain is actually healthy for many bird species, as feathers possess protective oils or powders that bind to germs and pathogens, so they could get washed away every time it rains. I was quite surprised to see these birds were happy to get wet. They eventually found a partially shaded spot that received a light mist where they could nap. I watched as the rains continued to pour down in Pandora. Eventually, a pool began to form on the forest floor, the start of the flood. I made sure to watch the water level through the glass from the eastern end. Though a mini flood has happened in Pandora in the past, due to a malfunction in the irrigation system once, that flood was nothing compared to the flood that was coming this time. And it was Pandora's soil life I was most worried about. I noticed a beetle grub against the glass, curled up in its little burrow. Oh no. I sure hoped this thing would dig up to higher soils, checking the water level. It was getting close. It's a soil creature though. Surely it's able to know when a flood is coming, right? I sure hope so. As for other soil creatures, I could see a ton of little critters moving in the topsoil layer. This area of soil towards the higher land portion was full of life, from these white creatures, of which I don't know the species, to mites, to springtails, worms, to even an earwig right there, eating a seed. These creatures would be safe from the flood, as they were on higher ground, and went about their business like nothing was happening. Other creatures in the lowest soils weren't so safe. I spotted an isopod trapped on a leaf island, as the water level was rising higher and higher. I sure hoped it would manage to find dry land, but what caught my attention was some movement below the leaf it was on. Movement beneath the waterline. It was then that an entirely different world in Pandora was revealed to me. The water was just teeming with life. All kinds of microscopic creatures and worms. And who knows what else those things were, swam through the waters joyously. I couldn't believe how much life was swimming in the floodwater. My only guess was that these creatures naturally inhabited the soils of our forest and had been liberated from their usual living space by way of this rising water. Though too tiny for the human eyes to see, I realized that this flood was extracting an entire biome of life from the soils. Minuscule creatures I had no idea even existed in our forest until now. I could see a ton of worms that weren't water-dwelling emerging from the soil, struggling to climb upwards to dry land. So far it seemed some of the creatures, like the birds, would be okay for the remainder of the typhoon. But as for everything else that wasn't able to crawl upwards on time, the typhoon flood would consume them in her unforgiving waters. My heart sank as I watched the beetle grub's chamber fill with water. No! Though I knew realistically some lives might be lost during this process, I still felt so guilty actually seeing it happen before my eyes. I wish I hadn't seen it, but I had to remind myself this was all part of Mother Nature's process. Regardless, it hurt me to watch the grub die. What have I done? After 3 hours of rain, I approached Pandora and couldn't believe my eyes. Our forest had turned semi-aquatic. Never had I seen so much water in Pandora. It was so crazy to see. Sunny came out and began to wade and forage along the water's edge. Looking into the water, I spotted a Lamplanaria, a resident predatory flatworm. Now normally, as a wormphobe, I would be repulsed, but this time, my heart broke for it. Had it died? Nope. It began to squirm, and it looked like some of the microscopic aquatic creatures were attaching to its skin. I wondered if they were biting it. It struggled to break the water's surface tension to get to the air above. Yes! Go, Lamplanaria, go! It would be surviving today, and I can't believe I was actually celebrating. The plethora of microscopic life residing in the water still blew my mind. I could see worms, but what were those other creatures? I couldn't even begin to guess what category of life they belonged to. Any microbiology experts out there? Care to chime in to guess what sorts of life is seen swimming here? Seeing this is also why I will never drink water from a pond, swamp, or river, unless it's boiled first. And beyond that, I also noticed the water was developing a sort of cloudiness that was surely masses of microscopic bacteria or protists, too small for the human eye to see. I was blown away by the degree of life that was being pulled from Pandora's soils. But this wasn't all. It turns out I was about to discover some brand new inhabitants in our forest by night that weren't so microscopic. Night fell in Pandora, and all was still. The quails were asleep by the water's edge. I spotted Jay-Z waiting to find Beyoncé as he did every night since the start of rainy season. Poor guy. Let me go check up on her for you. I went up to Arcadia to attempt to find Beyoncé, and it was here where I made a crazy discovery. There was one of the 3 resident micro squirrels. And there's 2. They always dart away when I approach the tank. And 3. Wait, is that a tail? Okay, wait, 2 micro squirrels now. I then spotted this micro squirrel, and usually I could tell them apart when they keep still by color. But weird, it had the wild type brown color of our eldest Dorothy, but the high white of Theodore. It was then that I realized what I was looking at. AZ family, the micro squirrels have been breeding. This was a new baby, first generation Orcadian micro squirrel. No way! I opened the tank and checked the micro squirrel in the bowl and realized it too was just a baby. It looked at me strangely, probably the first time it's seen a human this close. It was so beautiful, and still too young to have learned to be afraid of larger creatures. But once it spotted one of its colony members bolting for safety, it instinctively followed, and ran, still insecure with its jumping abilities. I closed the door and allowed it to eventually scurry home. I wondered how many micro squirrels we had now, and tried to count. 2 up there, there's another that just headed down to Pandora. And hey, there's Dorothy, a very fat Dorothy. As I looked closer, I realized she was a very pregnant Dorothy. Look at how big she was. Wow. I mean, congrats. But man, this micro squirrel colony was about to explode. There's another, and another. Here's another baby. Or was that one we've already seen? Oh, there's Beyoncé. But my mind wasn't quite concerned about her right now. It had only been 3 months since we moved in 3 micro squirrels into our forest, and they were already beginning to establish quite a presence. I didn't expect them to reproduce this fast, but we would at some point need to come up with a solution to reduce their population, as they would completely eat all prey insects in our rainforest. Oh, hey there, Valentino. The next morning, I began to drain the water from Pandora. It had been 12 hours since the flood began. As crazy as this typhoon experiment was, I admit, I was a bit sad. I just wasn't quite sure if this whole typhoon simulation was worth it. Other than the discovery of a ton of microscopic life in the soils, I don't think I had gained any other insight from flooding out Pandora. I actually wasn't even sure if our rainforest benefited in any way from the simulated typhoon. other than perhaps an extra watering of the plants. But what weighed on my conscience was that this whole typhoon experiment actually cost the ecosystem lives. I watched the microscopic gang of creatures being sucked away with the siphoned water. And it was then that something occurred to me. I was about to flush all this runoff water down the drain when suddenly I had the most incredible eureka moment. Our rainforest did need to have these typhoon events. They are vital to the ecosystem. It was time for me to complete the cycle now. I opened Hydrometa and began to dump a bowl full of the runoff into the waters. I watched as the fish swam through the brown liquid, entering their home. Why was I doing this? Well, it dawned on me that the removal of this brown floodwater was not the end game. Watching the brown water travel through the tube, it reminded me of the brown waters moving through channels in my yard to the creek in the forest. It made me realize that the next step was for this runoff liquid from Pandora to flow to its next destination, which in our system was the wetlands. Hydrometa, now the biodiverse gang of billions, possibly trillions of microorganisms, worms, protists, etc., could seed Hydrometa, joining its ecosystem and adding to its biodiversity. A lot of these tiny creatures would go on to be food for the fish and other animals. Some of them would go to help decompose organic waste in the waters and occupy other possible ecological niches. On top of this, I realized that there was more. During the hot summer months, when it rarely rains, and all the plants and trees in my area shrivel up, shedding their leaves to self-preserve, all that leaf litter collects on the ground and decays. Tiny soil creatures then come in and eat that decaying matter, and their poop becomes valuable fertilizer for plants. And by the time rainy season comes around, all that nutrient-rich fertilizer gets distributed deeper into the soils and also carried away by streams to new and far-off areas. The plants in Hydrometa could now eat up this soup of nutrients that took Pandora's soil creatures an entire summer to culture. The brown water was a soup of life. I also made sure to pour some of it into Arcadia, seeing as had these banyan trees been connected to Pandoran soils below, they too would have benefited from the soup. Healthy trees and plants would in turn mean healthy, thriving animals. Speaking of which, I was surprised to learn that the various rainforest creatures all had their methods for surviving these necessary flooding events, including our beetle grub, which I thought was long dead, but upon checking, was in fact still alive. See it moving? Surviving after being submerged in water for over 12 hours is crazy. Not sure how that worked, but it made sense that each of these animals would have evolved ways to deal with mass flooding of their habitat. Looking around, the soils were back to normal, with a ton of isopods and mites everywhere. I even spotted a crab, which I totally forgot existed in our forest. I noticed mushrooms popping up in certain places in the days following the flood, and realized that the runoff was also a way for spores and seeds to find new places in which to grow. This all opened my eyes to the fact that rains and floods were more than just for the watering of plants. They were nature's delivery systems. superhighways for microorganisms, seeds and spores, and a ton of valuable nutrients to travel to new and far-off areas, allowing for life and life-giving ingredients to cycle around. Rain, once on land and interacting with soils, is like the blood of planet Earth, part of a complex and massive delivery system that I was grateful to have captured a glimpse of on a smaller scale here within our rainforest Vivaria. And in the end, the greatest lesson I learned from all this was that when it rains, it pours life. I spun the wheel of Gaia to see what our next ecological event was. And this was what it landed on. Oh, interesting. I have just the creature in mind. Vote in my community tab to affect this story.